It does require a very bold politician to take this on.
The UK is on course to have the highest migration rate in Europe.
We looked into some of the judgments of the European Court. It's judicial overreach. The judiciary isn't entirely all of it independent. You've got this constant pull factor. Until you can break that cycle, you're not going to be able to stop small boats coming across to the UK with illegal entrance, I don't think.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and I'm delighted to be joined by Tony Smith, the former head of the UK Border Force and Managing Director of Fortinus Global. Welcome, Tony.
Hello, hi there.
Tony, it seems as if every week we read a new absurdity about the UK's immigration system. There are stories abound about Albanian criminals whose children don't like foreign chicken nuggets and so they can't be deported, or we read about sex offenders whose sexual offences might put them in danger if they're sent back to Afghanistan, all kinds of things like that. You're an expert in this field. How do we end up with these stories? How do those things actually come about?
So essentially, immigration and border control has changed quite a bit over recent years. This is largely due to the interpretation of international conventions, specifically the 1951 Convention on the Treatment of Refugees, Asylum, and also on the Human Rights Convention. And those conventions have sort of permeated, if you like, into UK law in one form or another over the years. So essentially, if someone comes to this country unlawfully or stays unlawfully, normally, the border force or the immigration enforcement teams would initiate removal proceedings and send them back. Then invariably now, instead of just saying, oh, okay, I'll go back, they will lodge an application to stay, usually either on the grounds of asylum or human rights. And that is a tortuous process. It goes through a huge range of litigation, ending up in usually in the courts where a judge, an immigration judge somewhere, some of the judgments you referred to weren't actually decisions of the Home Office. The Home Office decided to refuse those applications, but the person involved lodged an appeal, as they're entitled to do, to the Immigration Tribunal, and it is those judges really who are interpreting international conventions in such a way that pretty well, anything that might impact upon your life by being sent away from this country, having entered it, could be potentially a breach of your human rights. Usually, Article 3, you're going to face inhuman or degrading treatment back home, or Article 8, you've established some kind of a family connection here, and it would be wrong to deport you and break that connection. Those are the main reasons, I think, why we've got ourselves in a situation where it's very, very hard now for the border force and immigration enforcement to remove people because of essentially the legal framework that's built up over the years that kind of disables them from doing so.
And do you think that process has become politicised? Because, if you talk about certain human rights, the right not to be treated, not to be tortured, to have inhumane and degraded treatment, people would agree with that. People would agree with the right to a family life. But do you think, is there something political about the interpretation that means that essentially that can mean anything, that can prevent pretty much anyone from being deported?
Yeah, so I did a bit of work with the UK Policy Exchange on this about 5 years ago, where we looked into some of the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. And these were clearly, it's called judicial overreach, but it is essentially judges applying a series of interpretations to what we mean by a breach of the Human Rights Convention. And those interpretations have been broadened, if you like, by European courts and then relied upon by UK judges. If you look into some of the backgrounds of some of those judges, which are now being finally exposed in the media, you will see that quite a few of them are outspoken about their views on immigration and are quite harsh on immigration enforcement decisions and have lobbied separately for a reform in favour of more immigration and a less stringent border control. So I do think that there is something in the fact that, the judiciary isn't entirely all of it independent. There are some political motivations, but they have a legal framework under which to, if you like, under a shade of the umbrella under which to hide, which is these international conventions and how they've been interpreted by judges, mainly in the European courts in the past. We say, well, actually, you talk about the fact that somebody is going to be denied some kind of a food or can't get access to a food that they need or medical treatment or whatever. Well, in our opinion, that is a breach of the Human Rights Convention, because that would lead them having their treatment back home because they couldn't get access to those items would be inhuman. Now, the man on the street might say, well, that's nonsense. Fact is that actually you're not going to really be suffering inhuman or degrading treatment. But what do we think those people that wrote those conventions back in 1951 were thinking about? My own view is that was just after the Second World War, and they were thinking very much about the Nazis and about the way that the Jewish people were persecuted, and they wanted to build some kind of international protection to make sure that we didn't see another Hitler. And if we did see another Hitler, then people sort of fleeing from that regime would be given sanctuary and support. I think that's really the motivation generally behind the 51 conventions. But yeah, here we are now, what is it, 77 odd years later, more than 70 years later, still relying upon, these various expanded interpretations of international law to dictate our own immigration and border policy. And I think increasingly the public are getting more and more concerned about this, because I don't think they voted for it, actually. I think most pollsters will tell you that many of the electorate would prefer a stronger border. They don't like the idea of people coming here, particularly coming here without a permission on a small boat, without a passport, and then being allowed in and potentially never being sent back. They understand, well, we never voted for that. Why is that? And the reason is because there is this sort of legal framework that's been built up that really needs to be absolutely dismantled by a very bold government to say, well, actually, this isn't valid anymore. In today's world, we're not going to give people asylum or listen to human rights claims from people who come illegally. We're going to send them away. And people would be happy with that. But the question is, well, where are you going to send them to? France won't take them back because that's political. They've got enough asylum seekers of their own, thank you very much. So they're quite happy if they're getting across into the UK, some of them. And, some of the countries they come from, places like Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, quite often they do qualify for asylum, actually. And even if they don't qualify for asylum, it's really, really hard to get them documented and returned to those countries. So you've got this constant pull factor of people seeing other people, from certain groups, getting into boats, getting into the UK and not being sent back. Until you can break that cycle, you're not going to be able to stop small boats coming across to the UK with illegal entrance, I don't think.
And how do we strike a balance between finding and protecting people who genuinely are refugees? Because I think the public does want to shelter people. If you think about the amount of sympathy people had for Ukrainians or for the Hong Kongers being persecuted by the Chinese government. How do we strike that balance? We don't want to say a firm no to everyone, but also it seems as if we have been far too soft to touch and are letting people in who probably shouldn't really have a claim to asylum.
Yeah, well, the original idea back in the day, which I was brought up on when I was in the Home Office, was we would agree to accept a certain number of people, mainly through the UNHCR resettlement program. So really, if a country's in real trouble, there's been a coup or something and people are fleeing, they won't usually jump on the first plane they can find to anywhere in the world. They will probably head to another part of their own country where they're not in trouble or to the next neighbouring country. That's where the UNHCR are funded to establish camps to look after people. And what was happening was that the UK, Australia, America, Canada would accept a certain number of the most vulnerable of those people and would bring them in through a managed scheme. And we've had managed schemes that you've mentioned. We've had managed schemes with Afghanistan, with Hong Kong, more recently with Ukraine, where you are responding to a specific situation that has arisen, which puts a lot of people in peril, and you are doing your bit, if you like, to respond to that situation. It was never the plan, though, that people could flee their own country, cross multiple borders, which we would call in the trade asylum shopping, to eventually get to a place where you think you'd quite like to stay, such as the UK. And the fact is that the people that are coming across from France in small boats, we know a great many of them have been in Europe for a very long time. In fact, they've been out of their own country for a very long time. They've probably even applied to stay in other countries who've refused them. And they think, well, I'll come to the UK and lodge my claim there. So there was an interpretation back actually in the 2000s in legislation that if you are not immediately fleeing persecution, then Article 31 doesn't apply to you. And actually, you can't get asylum in this country because you haven't you're not immediately fleeing persecution. That was a good reason we did remove some people under the detained fast track systems. We also had third country removal arrangements when I was in the UK BA. But unfortunately, all of those systems have pretty well been trumped by what we were talking about early on, by the fact, well, even, you have to hear my asylum claim here. You have to hear my human rights claim. Now, the last government did advocate a process which you may know about, the Rwanda Plan. There was the Illegal Migration Act, the Safety of Rwanda Act, the Nationality and Borders Act. There were three bits of legislation they tried to put in place during the last parliament, which didn't eventually get implemented, most of it. But that's what they said. They said, look, you're not going to get in here if you come from France because there's no fear in France. You've chosen to come here. You could have stayed in France and been perfectly safe. So you're not getting into our asylum system at all. And if we can't send you back to France, so we're going to find somewhere else that will take you where you will be safe. And that place would have been Rwanda. But as you know, the government changed. The election was called. The new government said that was a gimmick. They threw that out. And so this government haven't really got anywhere to send people. They've taken this new approach, which is, well, why don't we smash the gangs and let's give more funding to the National Crime Agency. Let's create a new Border Security Command and let's get after the international smugglers that are behind this, rather than concentrating on the business model that they adopt and removing the incentive. Now, my own personal view is that was a mistake, because I think you have to you have to create a deterrent to the business model, because whilst there is still a promise that you can get in this boat and get to stay in the UK, people are still going to take that option and pay for it. And every time you arrest one bunch of smugglers, because there's so much money involved, there's another gang just waiting in the wings to take over. So I think we've made a bit of a mistake in not having a deterrent. And unfortunately, we are now seeing an increase again in the small boat arrivals.
And do you think there's any sort of Western country, developed country, that is getting this issue right? I mean, you mentioned obviously France has a lot of asylum seekers, has its own problems. Germany famously has its own problems. Even in the US, not bounded by the European Convention, obviously people voted for Donald Trump because of the crisis at the border there. Is anyone getting it right? Are there any lessons that we can learn from elsewhere?
Well, I was asked that question. I gave evidence to the Bill Committee recently. I mean, if we're talking about stopping illegal entry, then the only real test was the Australia Operation Sovereign Borders model in 2015. They were having lots of problems with boats coming across from Indonesia, and they adopted a tactic which said, well, no, we're not going to let you come to Australia. We're going to intercept you before you get here. And we're going to process you at sea, and then we're going to take you to some other place, either Christmas Island or Nauru, and you will never, ever achieve your ambition to get to Australia. Now, the government of the day were hugely bold in taking that step. They were criticised by the international community, a lot of refugee groups, a lot of other countries. That's not fair, that's a breach, but they did it, and it worked. Actually, there aren't any boats arriving in Australia anymore. I mean, I think what we're seeing in the West, particularly, in the EU, they are decreasing asylum intake by stealth, really. They are doing things that they said they would never do, but there's clear evidence that they are funding Coast Guard patrols off the coasts of Tunisia and Libya to turn back asylum seekers back to those countries. Exactly the sort of thing that we would quite like to do, I think, in the English Channel, which is a no-no as far as the EU are concerned. They're actually doing that exactly same thing on their external borders down in the Mediterranean, and they are building fences around the eastern bloc across Poland and whatever to stop people coming in from places like Belarus. So they have actually adopted some prevention tactics in the EU, which would have been frowned upon by the EU a few years ago. And I think that's because of political push to the right by many parties who are gaining traction with their communities and their electorates to say, we've had enough of this. We can't keep having more and more people coming in here. So I think that the EU are moving, and if you check the Frontex figures, they are down about 25% on last year. They've been going down for a while in terms of incursions into the EU. And as you say, look at the new administration in the US. I mean, Trump's come in and, well, he is a law unto himself, isn't he? He's just said, well, I'm not having this. I said I wouldn't. I'm written an executive order now. I'm putting the military down there on the southern border, and I'm going to start, putting planes back to, American, Central American countries. And if you don't like it, well, then I'm going to do all kinds of nasty things to your country in return. And so, the figures across the US southern border have dropped through the floor. There's hardly anybody now getting across the southern border because they've been very, very bold. So, but it does require a very bold politician to take this on. Someone who's really prepared to challenge the international order, to take the flak and to say, I'm sorry, but this is what my country voted for. And if necessary, I'm going to demur from the ECHR. I'm going to demur from the 51 conventions. I'm going to write my own law, actually, which you can challenge it as much as you like, right up to the Supreme Court. But as far as I'm concerned, that's what I've been elected to do. But then you just find yourself in this huge legal, it's such a litigious business, immigration and borders now. I mean, it must be the biggest legal area around for a lawyer to get into because there's so many judgments and different countries' interpretations of judgments and so many lawyers involved. It would take a bold step, but I think the only way that you're really going to stop this is to have that approach where you say, well, sorry, enough is enough. We're going to pass a new law which says you can't have asylum and human rights claims will not be considered if you come here from a country like France. You could have done all that stuff in France, but you still got to find somewhere to send them to. And that is the challenge. If you can't get a country to take them back, well, then what are you going to do? You're still going to have to allow them to stay in this country. So, it is a real problem. But for me, I thought the Rwanda plan, for all the expense, for all the criticism, for all the arguments around it, was a bold attempt by the last government. They weren't prepared to go far enough, though. In the end, they weren't prepared to take that final step to make that legislative framework so secure that actually you could not lodge a human rights claim in this country. And that's really what scuppered it. There were continual legal challenges over the safety of Rwanda. We had to build asylum centres in Rwanda. I mean, Rwanda said they'd accept anybody. There's no need to claim asylum. They'll let you stay anyway. But they still made us build an asylum system. We can't have a country without an asylum system. They built an asylum system for no reason, really. And, we could quite easily have resettled people in Rwanda. And I've just heard this week that the US have already sent a couple of people there. I wouldn't be surprised if another country steps in with something like that. We've seen things like the Albanian offshoring model being raised, even by this government, talking about looking at that, which is really a poor man's Rwanda. But I do think you need to find a country somewhere that is prepared to accept people, that wants people, that's prepared to accept people and settlement in their country in order to create that deterrent. If you have not done that, then I don't see how you're going to remove the incentive for people to keep coming.
And how do staff at places like the Border Force react to some of these things? Do they side with the human rights judges and lawyers, or are they frustrated by all of this?
Well, of course, they can't talk to you. Nobody in the Border Force is allowed to speak to the media or the Home Office, really, unless they have a clearance from the Home Office Communications Branch, which is controlled by the special advisors to the government. So they will be given specific lines to take if they are invited on interviews. So you won't find any. It would be a very brave and bold Border Force officer who would come on here and say, well, I don't like the idea of, having to take these people in from France. But I can tell you from my own informal challenge, I worked there for 40 years. I still know a number of officers who are serving in Border Force, immigration enforcement. And yes, of course, they are frustrated because they didn't join the Border Force to rescue people at sea. I mean, if you want to do that, well, join the RNLI or something. I mean, they joined the Border Force to enforce the law, and that is to stop people entering this country without documents and to ensure that people who are coming into this country have the relevant permissions to do so. And if they don't, to send them back. So, of course, there's a lot of head scratching that goes on at the operational level of the Border Force, but they don't actually control this. I mean, I think it's a bit of a misnomer, which you might be able to help me address, that this is all down to the Border Force because they're all lefty, trying desperately. They're not actually. They're really trying to do the job that they were put in place. They've got peace officer powers to arrest, detain, and remove illegal entrants, and they would quite like to be able to implement them, but they cannot breach the law. They cannot put the Home Secretary in contempt of court. And I think, yes, quite a lot of them find that frustrating that that's where they are. But that's the job, I'm afraid.
And finally, Tony, we've seen record numbers arrive on small boats this year. We have a huge asylum backlog, people in hotels all around the country. You've suggested that the Labour government doesn't really have much of a plan to deal with this. Where does it end up if we just carry on as normal? What happens next?
Well, of course, the Labour government argue they have got a plan, and they'll say we published our plan for change, and actually we've got this new border security command, and that's what we're going to do. So I think we've got to give them a chance to say I'm wrong, and they're right, and they can smash the gangs. We're going to give them that opportunity, and they'll say it's very early in the day, and they are doing things like more enforcement raids, more removals. What they're not doing though is removing the boat people. That's what you've got to do. You've got to see pictures going out on the telly that people are coming off boats, going to an airfield and flying off. And that will then send a message to those waiting to come across that they won't be able to come, in my view. So, I think we will still be able to keep numbers down to a reasonable level, and we have to be realistic about this. Actually, 40,000 in boats a year sounds a lot, but when you weigh that against 1 million people being given visas to come to this country anyway, through the legal migration routes, you weigh that against the fact we're still only about 5th or 6th highest in Europe in terms of asylum intake. It's not as bad as it may seem. I think what really frustrates people, it's the cheat card. We play cricket here. We play by the rules. We get passports and we get permissions and visas if we want to travel to another country. And when you see somebody jumping off the boat and punching the air because they've beaten the system, it really sticks in the claw, I think, of a lot of people that should not be happening. And so I think that there will continue to be pressure on whatever government, this one or the next one, to try and find a way of stopping the boats. But the only way you're going to stop the boats, either you do a deal with France and you say you take them straight back to France and they can claim asylum there. The French or the EU don't seem to be up for that. Or you find some other way of doing it, as I say, by finding another place that you can do the offshoring. And I think that will be the key test as to whether or not we can stop this. Otherwise, I fear we're just going to continue to see a flow. But how many, I don't know. I don't think it's going to become an armada, but I think it will continue to be an irritant. And it will continue to be headlines in the media every time a large boat arrives. And there will be increasing pressure upon the government to do something about it. So it is probably one of their highest priorities to try and sort it out.
Tony Smith, thank you very much.